Somewhere in the ancient Americas, long before cigarettes, before lighters, before corner stores stocking shelves with cartons of Marlboros, a human being made a decision that would echo across thousands of years of history. They picked up a bundle of dried leaves, brought them to their lips, and inhaled. That moment changed everything. Not just for that one person, but for civilizations, economies, wars, and the lungs of roughly 1 billion people alive on Earth right now. So when exactly did it happen? When did humans first smoke tobacco? The answer is stranger, older, and far more fascinating than most people realize. Let's start with what we actually know. For most of modern history, historians believe tobacco use began sometime around 6000 BCE. That was the educated guess based on when the tobacco plant is thought to have first been cultivated in the Americas. Reasonable enough. But in 2021, a team of archaeologists working in the Great Salt Lake Desert of Utah made a discovery that forced everyone to rethink the timeline entirely. In a hearth, buried beneath desert soil, they found the charred seeds of wild tobacco plants. Alongside those seeds, they found ancient fireplace remnants, dating back roughly 12,300 years. That is not a typo. 12,300 years ago. That pushes the known history of human tobacco use back by more than 6,000 years, deep into a period when humans in the Americas were still nomadic hunter-gatherers, following megafauna across open landscapes, hunting mammoths and giant ground sloths. We do not know for certain that these early humans were smoking the tobacco. They may have been chewing it, burning it as part of a fire ritual, or using it in ways we cannot yet identify. But the proximity of tobacco seeds to a fire site at that age is not something archaeologists dismiss lightly. It is the oldest physical evidence of a relationship between humans and the tobacco plant that we have ever found. And it raises an obvious question. If people were interacting with tobacco 12,000 years ago, how did something that began in the high desert of North America end up as one of the most globally traded commodities in human history? That story takes us through several distinct chapters. For thousands of years after those first encounters, tobacco use remained contained within the indigenous cultures of the Americas. Different peoples used it in profoundly different ways. In Mesoamerica, the Maya were among the earliest well-documented tobacco users we know of. Carvings found at Palenque in present-day Mexico depict priests blowing smoke through tube-shaped pipes, and hieroglyphic texts reference tobacco use in ceremonial contexts dating back to at least the 10th century. But the Maya were not outliers. Across North America, Central America, and South America, indigenous cultures had woven tobacco into the fabric of daily and spiritual life for centuries before any European ever set foot on the continent. Among many of the Great Plains nations of North America, tobacco was sacred. It was not a casual habit. It was a ritual substance offered to the spirit world, burned during ceremonies to carry prayers upward with the smoke. The pipe itself was a sacred object, passed during councils, used to seal agreements, and offered in diplomatic exchange. To smoke with someone was to enter into relationship with them. This is part of why the image of the peace pipe, as simplified as that phrase is, carries such weight. The original meaning was not about relaxation, it was about covenant. In the Amazon basin, shamans used tobacco in far more intense ways. Some consumed doses that would be toxic to the average person today, entering altered states they believed allowed them to communicate with the spirit realm, diagnose illness, and perform healing. Tobacco, there was not a background substance. It was a primary tool of spiritual power. In the Caribbean, the Taino people had a practice of inhaling tobacco smoke through a forked tube they called a tabago, a word that most linguists believe gave us the modern name for the plant itself. When Spanish sailors arrived in the Caribbean in 1492, they encountered this practice almost immediately. And this is where the story takes its most consequential turn. Christopher Columbus and his crew were among the first Europeans to observe tobacco use directly. Taino people offered dried tobacco leaves as gifts when Columbus's ships made landfall. Two of his sailors, Rodrigo de Jerez and Luis de Torres, were sent inland to explore Cuba, and returned having witnessed locals smoking rolled tobacco leaves, inhaling the smoke, and exhaling it in long, slow clouds. Rodrigo de Jerez apparently tried it himself. He brought the habit back to Spain, where his neighbors were so alarmed by the sight of smoke pouring from a man's mouth that they reported him to the Spanish Inquisition. He reportedly spent 7 years imprisoned before being released, at which point tobacco use in Spain had become fashionable enough that no one thought twice about it anymore. That small story tells you everything you need to know about how quickly things moved. Within a single generation of European contact, tobacco went from a sacred indigenous practice in the Americas to a commodity that European elites were experimenting with, debating, promoting, and banning in turns across multiple continents simultaneously. By the mid-1500s, a French diplomat named Jean Nicot, posted in Lisbon, had heard about tobacco's supposed medicinal properties and began cultivating it and distributing it as a cure for migraines, skin disorders, and a range of other ailments. He sent samples to the French court and promoted it so aggressively that the plant was named nicotiana in his honor. His name lives on in the word nicotine, which means that a French diplomat who probably never even visited the Americas ended up etymologically embedded in the most addictive substance the plant produces. The medicinal framing was crucial to tobacco's early spread through Europe. Physicians published treatises claiming it could cure everything from toothaches to cancer. One Spanish doctor in the late 1500s published a book listing more than 25 diseases that tobacco supposedly treated. People inhaled it, rubbed it on their skin, and consumed it in ways we would find bizarre today, all in the name of health. The fact that they often felt a rush of energy or calm after using it seemed to confirm the medical claims. They did not yet understand why. They just knew something was happening. By the early 1600s, tobacco had spread beyond Europe into Africa, the Middle East, India, and Asia. The Ottoman Empire saw explosive growth in tobacco use and explosive backlash, with Sultan Murad IV making tobacco smoking punishable by death in the 1630s. He reportedly executed hundreds of people for it. It did not work. People kept smoking anyway, which speaks to how quickly physical dependence had taken hold across populations with no prior exposure to nicotine at all. In Japan, tobacco arrived via trade routes in the late 1500s and spread so rapidly that the Tokugawa shogunate issued multiple bans within decades of its arrival, each one ignored more thoroughly than the last. Back in the Americas, the Virginia colony, established in 1607, was nearly a complete failure until a colonist named John Rolfe successfully cultivated a milder strain of tobacco, Nicotiana tabacum, that proved far more palatable to European tastes than the harsher native varieties. He began exporting it to England in 1612. By 1616, Virginia was shipping roughly 2,500 pounds of tobacco annually to England. By 1629, that number had exploded to 1.5 million pounds per year. Tobacco did not just save the Virginia colony economically, it became the economic engine of early colonial America, and the insatiable demand for tobacco cultivation is directly tied to the dramatic expansion of the transatlantic slave trade. Since tobacco is a brutally labor-intensive crop to grow and harvest, the history of tobacco and the history of slavery in North America are not parallel stories. They are the same story. As the centuries progressed, the methods of consuming tobacco shifted considerably. Pipes dominated early use. Snuff, finely ground tobacco inhaled through the nose, became fashionable among European aristocrats in the 1700s. Cigars grew in popularity through the 1800s. And then, in the late 1800s, a machine invented by James Bonsack allowed cigarettes to be produced at an industrial scale. Before Bonsack's machine, cigarettes were hand-rolled and relatively expensive. Afterward, they were cheap, uniform, and available everywhere. The cigarette transformed tobacco from a leisure product for the wealthy into a mass consumer habit available to virtually anyone with a few cents to spare. The 20th century saw tobacco companies leverage that accessibility into something genuinely unprecedented. Advertising campaigns of almost unimaginable sophistication normalized cigarettes across every demographic. Doctors appeared in ads endorsing specific brands. Cigarettes were included in military rations during both World Wars, creating cohorts of addicted veterans who returned home and passed the habit to a post-war generation. By mid-century, smoking rates in Western countries had reached peaks that would be hard to exaggerate. In 1965, roughly 42% of American adults smoked. The number was similarly high across Europe, Japan, and much of the developing world. The reckoning came slowly. The link between cigarettes and lung cancer, long suspected and long suppressed by industry-funded research campaigns, became impossible to deny by the 1960s. The U.S. Surgeon General's report in 1964 marked a turning point. Decades of litigation, regulation, and public education followed. Smoking rates in wealthy nations fell significantly over the following half-century, though they remain devastatingly high in many lower-income countries, where the same advertising playbook that was eventually restricted in the West continues operating largely unchecked. And now we are back to those charred seeds in a Utah desert, sitting beside a 12,300-year-old fire. Whatever that ancient person was doing with those tobacco leaves, they could not have imagined any of this. They could not have imagined the slave plantations, the Ottoman executions, the Surgeon General's warning, the vaping devices teenagers hide in their backpacks today. They were living in a world without agriculture, without cities, without writing. They were following animals across a landscape that would eventually become the American West. But they had found something, a plant that did something to the human nervous system, something noticeable enough to keep reaching for it again. And that reaching, repeated across thousands of years by billions of people across every culture on Earth, is one of the strangest and most consequential threads running through all of human history. It started beside a fire in the desert. In some form or another, it has never really stopped.